My name is Ann Thompson. I am a proud alumna of Notre Dame. I graduated in the class of 1979, so I'm celebrating my 45th reunion. Thank you, and I'm just thrilled to be here today because the discussion we're about to have is a discussion I have wanted to have for more than a year now. In large part because it's something I think a lot about these days, and that is the role of mission and meaning to propel us to healthier, more productive, and more fulfilled lives. How mission and meaning can help us be a force for good for others and unlock the potential within each of us. And the three people sitting to my left are why I wanted to have this discussion. Let me start here with Dr. Jim O'Connell. He's a member of the class of 1970, and he is president of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless. Dr. David Gauss is a member of the class of 1984, celebrating his, what number were you?
40.
40th, yeah, it's like, you see, I was an arts and letters major. Math is just not my thing. And I've gone into television and I can't spell anymore, so it's all these good things. David, luckily, does have math and spelling skills, and he is the founder of Andean Health and Development in Ecuador. And so if you are all very proud of the fact that the men's lacrosse team won the national championship, a week ago? Dr. John Waggle had a role in that. He is a doctor, as in a PhD, and he is currently Notre Dame's Associate Athletic Director of Sports Performance. Now, each of them did something unexpected in their careers, and in doing so, they have changed the lives of so many people, and they opened doors to lives I don't think any one of the three of you could imagine. What am I talking about? Let's hear from them directly. Jim, as I said, you are a Notre Dame undergrad, Harvard Med School. You did your residency at Mass General, and you win an oncology fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, one of the world's leading cancer hospitals. It certainly is a textbook path to success, but you never got to New York. We could have been neighbors. So what happened?
I should have a good comeback to that but just to be clear, I didn't get to medical school till a long time after I left Notre Dame.
Because you tended bar
Right, I did a lot of driving. I was a philosophy major, so we got to drive cabs and tend bar and wait on things.
Or you could become president of the University of Notre Dame because Father John was a philosophy major. Things you could have done.
Things we could have done, see all the But no, the truth is what happened, I didn't get to medical school till I was 30. So for those of you who don't know what you want to do yet, you guys are all out already, but at this time. And then I was so focused on getting to work, getting a job, that it was in just before I was to go to New York, I got called in by my chief of medicine who had a different idea. And for those of you who are in medicine, when you get called in by your chief of medicine, it's like going to the principal's office. And everything is a rhetorical question. And so he had this thing, they needed a doctor for a new program in Boston to take care of homeless people. And the mayor was under pressure by homeless people to get a full-time doctor. They couldn't find one. In March of my senior year, my career got derailed for a year, I thought, to do this program. And I didn't know how to say no. And I figured since I graduated, remember in the 1960s, I heard somebody from the 70s was here because I just heard somebody yelled when we said class of 70. Barney Kane, I know Barney somewhere, there you are. But we graduated the year of Kent State. The 60s were really crazy. So I felt like it was time for me to give something back. And I wanted to go do this as a year of doing good.
And you never stopped doing good.
No, and 1 year became 2, and then but now I feel awful because it's been my only job for 40 years. But not in no way intended. I knew nothing about homelessness. This was not what I was planning to do.
David, you hail from a family of accountants in Milwaukee, and you go after you graduate, and you do a year of service in Ecuador, and you come back, and you tell Father Ted, I want to go to medical school. But you don't know how to do it, and he helps you along with Ann Landers. So tell us the story of how that happened.
The first thing is, you asked what happened to accounting. The first question is why accounting in the first place? And I can say, on the eve of leaving for Notre Dame as an incoming freshman, I asked my dad what he thought I should study, and he said, accounting. And I said, well, why, Dad? And he said, because when companies close, they're the last guys to leave.
Practical advice.
Divine inspiration. And then roll the clock ahead many years later, all my accounting friends said Gauss couldn't handle accounting, so he went into medicine. So I went through that discernment process during my senior year and came out on the other end of it going to Ecuador, met with Father Ted in one of those great Father Ted meetings in his office during senior year as a profoundly disturbed senior. There are a lot of us out there. And he opened the door for me, and when I was, after 2 years of being in Ecuador, and discovering that I was really profoundly changed by doing service work and wanting to do that professionally and thinking about medicine, I wrote that letter to him. And he opened the door, and I came back here and did my post-bac pre-med here. And he mentioned this to Ann Landers, and Ann Landers very kindly agreed to pay for my 2 years back here. And she was going to send him the check for the $20,000. It was $10,000 a year at that time. He said, no, just send it for the first year and let's see how he does. Anyway, and Ann Landers was an absolutely wonderful person, and met her many times over the years, and she helped me figure out how to do the med school thing, and she got that paid for through a scholarship from Bristol Myers Squibb, and the rest is history. And so it's a great story, not about me, but rather about two sensational people willing to take a chance on a kid with a half-baked idea and a bit of a dream.
And the difference that has made for hundreds of people in Ecuador now is really extraordinary. And John, Dr. John Waggle, you were a physics major in college, and then you became a baseball coach, and then a department head at the young age of 26. And again, another incredible path of success, straight line, and then you blow it all up to get a PhD. Why did you go back to school, and where has it taken you?
I think I actually had the timing really fortunate timing, I guess, in a sense, because I was young enough to still take a chance, in a sense, but I was also really lucky in that it was pretty apparent that the world of sport and supporting athletes was really rapidly changing, whether that was becoming a little bit more sophisticated and scientifically oriented, and there was this influx of technology. So you had these really obvious examples that you had to change with the tide a little bit. So that certainly factored into the decision to leave. But probably most importantly, I can share your thoughts or share your feelings of having a half-baked idea, that I quickly realized how fragile and finite the athletic career is. And that kind of raises your own standard and how you hold yourself accountable to support these people, and I just didn't feel like I knew enough. I didn't feel like I was good enough. I didn't feel like I was trained enough, partly because I was put into those leadership roles so early, and I felt a sense of accountability to hit pause on my own career, in a sense, to downstream better support the athletes, whether professional or collegiate, down the road.
I think one of the threads that goes through these three people is the importance of listening, which I think is a very underrated value in our society. It really makes a difference. And David, in Ecuador, you go down to Ecuador with this dream of starting a hospital, and there have been plenty of Americans who have gone out into the world with dreams of helping people who are less fortunate, and yet they go and they say, this is how we're going to do it this way because this is the way we do it in the US. You didn't do that. You listened. What kind of difference did listening make in your ability to bring healthcare to people who didn't trust modern medicine?
So there's listening on many levels, and if you don't listen, at least in our situation, if I don't listen, I'll get nowhere. Working in another culture with another group of people, it's an exercise in listening, and I've always considered myself as being really nothing more at a 30,000-foot level than a person who, from this country, who has brought resources to a country like Ecuador, and to put those resources in the hands of really bright Ecuadorians who know exactly what to do with it. So I was a facilitator, but I will share one story, which is the person that I work with the most in Ecuador to this day for the last 20 years. Grew up watching Old West television shows in Ecuador as a kid from the States, and he said he used to watch The Lone Ranger. And he said to me very early on, he said, David, Lone Ranger, remember his sidekick, Tonto? He said, I will never be your Tonto. And I said, thank you, Diego. Thank you. And so listening on many levels, trying to bring biomedicine to that part of the world that arguably thinks a different way about their health. We thought that we would convert that community into a community that embraces the biomedical model that we have in the United States. But in all honesty, it's been a give and take. There's been a lot of us having to move towards their view of the world and try and figure out how to introduce the biomedical model in a very traditional, old-fashioned, anthropologically way of doing it. And so that melding of those two worlds requires a lot of listening. And so some of the listening I knew how to do, some of it was I was told to do it. The Ecuadorian.
Jim, I think you had a similar experience after the chief of medicine came to you and asked you to lead this homeless program, and you go to the Pine Street Inn. How many people are from Boston or grew up in Boston? The Pine Street Inn. The Pine Street Inn is a very famous shelter in the city of Boston, and you meet a nurse named Barbara McGinnis, and she teaches you about listening. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, and I'm listening to David's story, which is amazing. So picture this. So my last job at Mass General was to be the senior resident running the intensive care unit. So I thought I had arrived. This is 4 years of medical school, the 3 years of residency. I'm now good. I know what I'm doing. And there's an interesting evolution in medical school, which you start with the ego about the size of a ping pong ball that gets tossed around, and by the end, you can't fit your ego into a room this big. And so I marched 6 blocks down the street after finishing the ICU, thinking, how tough can a shelter clinic be? I've just done. And I walk in, and there was this phalanx of really fierce, wonderful nurses who had been running a clinic there for about 15 years. And they had been mostly volunteer nurses from emergency rooms where they had realized that we can go down there and do a lot of work at the shelter. By the way, at that time, there were 800 people working in the shelter. And I should actually acknowledge that I'm staying with Steve Reifenberg, who was working there by about that time, who's now a professor here. But what the nurses, when I walked in, I thought they were going to be so thrilled to have a doctor. This is my first doctor.
Here I am to save the world.
Oh my God, and they were like stone cold angry. And they pointed out to me, they made me sit down, and they pointed out to me that doctors hadn't been very helpful to them, thank you very much, and that they'd been doing this 15 years and they'd teach me what to do. And Barbara, as sweet as she was, Barbara was a third order Franciscan and used to wear sandals and had this kind of Catholic worker mentality, which I always cherished. But she said, she was gentle to me. She said, look, we're going to teach you what to do. So Jess took away my stethoscope, took away all my medical stuff, and I had to soak feet for 2 months. That was my apprenticeship. So I'm coming from the ICU, and the nurses had this brilliant thing of where they would invite homeless people into the clinic, and then they had these basins where they would let people soak their feet, and they would take care of and be really kind to them, call them all by name. And I had to do that for 2 months. I'll never forget thinking, oh my God, I should be at Sloan Kettering, and here I am smelling feet. And but it was magic because it turned the power structure upside down, and it meant that we're used to being about a stethoscope, just like away from somebody's very personal space. And this was sitting at their feet. And I learned to just be patient and listen. And by the way, I have to throw in here, I wish I had a half-baked idea, by the way. I didn't have an idea to put in the oven at the time. So what I did learn, though, was that these were remarkable people, and the more you gave them time to get to know you, the more they would open up. And as Barbara pointed out, if you're going to do healthcare for folks like this, you have to, as David learned, and I'm sure John will, you have to be part of them. You have to listen to them. So that was my 2 months of painful, but ultimately really wonderful experiences.
You have to build trust.
Absolutely.
John, you came from the Kansas City Royals, where you not only oversaw the Major League Baseball team, but 6 minor league teams, is that correct? So you come to Notre Dame, you're not of Notre Dame, big fan, grew up, big Notre Dame fan, but you describe your first year here as a listening tour. What role has listening played in your adaptation to Notre Dame and getting people to trust you to talk about the most intimate part of their performance, which is their self-confidence?
Yeah, I think it took on a few different shapes, honestly. You first come to Notre Dame knowing how distinct and special it is, but in a room full of alums not having gone here, I knew that I certainly had a gap in understanding what that was, but probably what Notre Dame does better than anybody is acknowledging tradition without being traditional. And there are all these examples of that, whether it's the cutting edge research of Santiago Schnell in the College of Science or the Crossroads Project that Jack Swarbrick brought the whole campus together to execute. There's all these really unique juxtapositions of being distinctly Notre Dame, but also being at the front end of whatever field that you're in. I really needed to learn how to do that. And I needed to learn from those people and those examples and figure that out as best I could before implementing any change or any process improvements or adjustments here with our student athletes. And there's also some more obvious examples that in my role scale is really challenging. There's 26 different sports. There's obviously sport culture differences between that. And even as you all know, moving through your Notre Dame journey, you're even a different version of yourself. And so even understanding how a student athlete moves through their career here and what our coaches' pain points are, there's a laundry list, as I'm sure you're gathering from this opening here. Because of that, I felt very strongly that I needed to, in a sense, take a back seat, but I think these two know probably better than anybody that in leadership roles, that listening tour is oftentimes perceived as stepping back and allowing things to just operate around you, but it's actually a really enriching experience for us too, right? Learning is what actually happens in listening. And that's for me, I needed to learn from our medical team, our coaches, our dietitians, our strength conditioning folks, psychology, and really that's what led to some of our early directions, whether that be sleep support, learning from some of the academic and athletic demands of our kids and what our psychology team was telling me that our kids were dealing with, or being able to streamline our recovery support. There's a lot of passive or transactional approaches to recovery, and we tried to revamp that and create a little bit more autonomy and agency for our student athletes to pick the direction that they wanted to go and still be aligned with what's best practice. But those types of things actually came from just sitting back and saying, okay, I've got a lot to learn here, a lot of gaps, and it's ended up being one of the ways that we're able to create alignment and to stay really focused on what matters, is to hit pause on those things from time to time. And though I articulated it as my year one objective, I hope to never lose sight of that. And I think the thing I'd close with in that sentiment is I viewed this role as a 10 or more year horizon to get it right. We're all temporary stewards of the seat that we sit in, and we're really trying to move Notre Dame forward for generations of student athletes. It is about the lacrosse championship that we just won. It's not that we can make decisions in the short term at the expense of the long term, and so because of that, you've got to have this really unique balance of flexibility and conviction with what you're doing. And we just try to be as pragmatic as possible and take those pauses when necessary.
The other thread that goes through the three of you is that you've always been, or in your jobs today, you're driven to help others. And my question is, has it always been that way? Was that something that evolved over time? How did it function? Jim, you thought about going to Sloan Kettering, and yes, being an oncologist clearly would help others, but that intimate, direct helping others that you do with the homeless in Boston, why did you choose to, I guess the question really is, why did you choose to stay with that?
A good question, because I've been thinking this over since the title of this was that. I suspect, like many of us, I look back at my parents my father never got out of high school. He was a really devout Catholic. We grew up in an Irish Catholic town where the parish was north, south, east, and west. And helping others was just what you did. And so I think I probably never escaped that voice of my mom and dad, making sure we help others. I remember when I was 30 and finally decided it was medical school I wanted to do, it was mainly because it was a way to help others without having to explain why you're there. And
There are probably easier ways to do it, but okay.
yeah, it's true. I should have thought about that part. But and then I think when I was training, I was fascinated by taking care of people who had cancer, and it was end of life care. So I wanted to learn more about that. So it was I think a drive to be helpful. And I was surprised when I got derailed and got to the shelter. It was amazing the need out there. The need for people. The need is infinite. And then we could only do bits and pieces, but we could really make a difference in certain people's lives. And that I think is what kept me going. It was the beginning at the time I started, it was a major TB epidemic. AIDS had just hit, and then everybody was dying. It was awful for those who You remember back into 1985, we had no treatment. We didn't even know what was causing it. So I was just taking care of a lot of people who were dying. We couldn't do anything. And I think that sort of motivated you to keep trying to go on.
The other thing I remember about the 80s is yuppies. It was this pursuit of consumption at that period in society at that time. People were wearing shoulder pads and driving BMWs, and it was all about what you had. And yet you go to help those who have nothing. How did you not get caught up in that stream?
I don't know. I think I was probably so busy thinking it was hard enough getting through medical school
Yeah.
and residency that I felt like I was now giving back. But being a doctor meant I had something I really wanted to do. So I spent a lot of time. Just once, after I went to graduate school for a couple of years, and I taught high school in Hawaii for a couple of years. And I was in paradise. It was great. I used to coach the basketball team. We would travel to the islands to play the other schools. And I realized I loved being there, but I wasn't doing what I loved doing. And you're so isolated in paradise that I wanted to get back on the journey of finding out what can I be doing that feels like I'm giving at the same time I really enjoy it. And I lucked into medicine. That was...
And John, you were a baseball coach. You could have kept doing that. Could have won national championships or something, whatever. But you chose to take a different path. Why?
A little bit of it was that I felt that I could have a broader impact if I got out of the coaching world. And my current position's a great example of that. I get the opportunity to work with 26 teams versus the one that I was working with during coaching, even though it's really rewarding to have those deep connections with the kids that are on your team. Like that is certainly part of it. But I think the other piece that really draws you to broader disciplines or more breadth in your role is it's really rewarding to help other people. Yeah, we always view it and it's about the other people, but it fills your cup up so much. And admittedly, being young, some of it was, I really enjoy helping these people, but imagine the opportunity to help even more people, or to be in a position that affected change in the way that athletes were cared for, the longevity of careers, and mental health was starting to gain some popularity in that space, and performance nutrition and those types of things. That I think as you looked around that landscape with coaching, it certainly gave me a start, but it was really the spark that led to a lot of different pursuits downstream.
And David, what about you? What drove you to help others?
I didn't have that service bug even going through Notre Dame. It wasn't part of me. I don't want to ascribe it to an epiphany, but I will say that when I was in Ecuador, I remember about halfway through my 2 years there, I would get up in the morning, make breakfast with the cooks in the kitchen for the members at this family development project, work all day there. There was a small farm I would participate on. I did the novice program for the Bengals when I was a senior here, and the kids in Ecuador, the street kids, all love martial arts, and so they insisted on a boxing program. So I did that in the evening, and I just remember one night coming home about 10 o'clock, walking to my house, and feeling just something really good inside. And I thought to myself, I can't imagine finding anything that could touch this, that I prepared myself academically to do when I go back to the United States. And so that's when the idea of medicine came into my mind. And I thought about it, and I just felt this passion coming on. And I felt like with time, I figured out that if you can take passion and convert it into some community need and do something that way, you've now found a vocation. And so many people think about vocations as exclusively a religious thing, but it's clearly not that. It's not just a religious thing. And so I did that. And then, of course, when Father Ted, I came back and told my mom and my dad that I wanted to do medicine. And my mom, who was a wonderful lady, just didn't always say the right things. And she said, David, I thought you had to be smart to go to medical school. But then when Father Ted latched onto this and completely supported it, then there was obviously the buy-in and so on. So I'm just saying that because you can imagine how Father Ted's support energized me to do this. And then it just built, and so that's been my journey towards wanting to do service as a career.
Is there something inherently, So how has having that service mission at the center of your lives changed who you are as people? When you look at your life, Jim, because we are the oldest on this panel, when you have that lens of time and you look at who you were when you started, when Barbara McGinnis took the stethoscope off your neck and put it in a desk drawer, and where you are today, how have you changed? What is your personal evolution, and how has that been affected by your mission?
Two things. One is I'm the oldest one on this panel, okay?
Well,
And when I wanted to flippantly say, oh, I haven't changed. It's interesting when you say it like that, because I think we all, when you look back on your career, it looks like this straight line to what you're doing. It feels,
and it never
and then you
is.
look and you realize, wow, there were so many times when we were either so discouraged or so angry at what was going on in the society that doing this job became just angering. And I think where I changed certainly was in learning how to, remember, because we were here in the 60s, Barney and I were here when Kent State happened, right? And we were used to big picture things, and what do you do to change that? And when you're dealing with people, especially in medicine the way we were, you're really trying to take care of someone who has cancer and is really facing a terrible thing, and that becomes your focus. And if the rest of everything is interfering with that, it gets in the way. So I think the biggest change I had was to realize that our job is just to take care of people, not even to cure them, but to take care of them, cure them when we can, and to let go of those awful, angering societal things that really have created this tragedy. So I think I now, if I were looking at my 1968 self, I'd think I was a wimp, because I backed
In
off.
1960?
No, yeah, I would have said, for me to now tell you I'm not protesting the big thing, even though I hate it, but concentrating on doing something like this, I think I would have, my younger self would be really angry.
Because you didn't do the big
That
thing.
we should be fixing this big problem, which I'd love to do, but we had to come to grips. I'm sure David and John, and I don't know, I'm just learning you, but probably in yours, but we can only do what we can do. We can take care of the people in front of us and join others in trying to change society. But you really got to take the joy for me and the satisfaction is in getting to know those folks, winning their trust, and taking care of them, even if it ends up that they're going to die. And to be there for them is what it became all about. I don't think I would have been patient enough to say this 20 years ago, even 25 years ago.
David, have you found that in building the 2 hospitals that you've built in Ecuador and training Ecuadorians to be doctors and nurses there, that it's not about fixing an entire medical system, but if you can fix what's in front of you, that's the accomplishment?
It definitely is that. And I would say that being in medicine, you get a view into a human being, and you get a view and understanding of the human condition that you don't oftentimes get in other professions. And with that human condition, both the frailty of people, and you see their incredible energy and resilience at the same time. And that had a profound impact on me. And that, I think, is really what led me to start thinking about later in life about what does that mean to me. And so where all this has led me over the years is really to look for, and occasionally finding it, sometimes frequently, sometimes very infrequently, looking for the grace of God and looking for that in people. And looking how God works through people, and that in those very intimate experiences with patients. You see it on a daily basis, but if you're not looking for it, you don't know what's hitting you. Stumble on it, stand up, dust yourself off, and get on with your life as if nothing happened. But if you're paying attention to it, you do that.
John, you're nodding in agreement. Do you see the same thing in your work?
Yeah, and we're fortunate actually at Notre Dame to have Dominic Vachon. He's one of the leading researchers actually in compassion in medicine. Even if the altruism, the empathy weren't necessarily your personality as a medical practitioner, even the scientific support is reason to really be a compassionate caregiver and to improve outcomes in that manner. But I think the 3 of us up here, and these 2 are shining examples of it, that meaning for service is deeper for us, and it is a little bit more of a life's calling. And I go back to your original question of how has this maybe lens on life change us, and I don't know that it has changed me. Jim, you brought that up a little bit, because I had such unique examples growing up. The role models that I had, whether it was my grandfather, one of the most selfless people, and I can still remember when he passed, I'm from a town of 400 people, but he had a line at his visitation that wrapped around half the town. But it's just because he quietly served a lot of people in that community. I have an uncle who's a Monsignor. He's devoted his life to serving other people, and for someone who goes about his own day to day without two nickels to rub together, but he has such a fulfilled existence. I had these really good examples, and one of them that I'm comfortable sharing with this group because we're amongst friends, but addiction and alcoholism are present in my family as well, and I've seen a lot of gifts wasted. And so when I look at my own experience, my own journey, goodness, I wasn't going to waste them because there's so much good to do, whether that's to help the people that are around you, or because I talked about the fragility and the finite nature of the athletic career to beginning. We also on this planet get one opportunity and it's very finite. And so seeing some of those negative examples of wasted gifts also resonated with me and drove me to say, okay, I want to have the impact that this place deserves and now carry that with me day to day here at Notre Dame.
What role has faith played in your lives and in your careers, and how has it animated what you do? Jump ball, gentlemen.
This is really all about David, so we should. No, I would answer. I think it's been a journey, on the faith journey. But, I think the fundamental meaning of faith to me is, caring for others and struggling to do that, even though you've got all these things going on. And I grew up Catholic. Obviously, came to Notre Dame. I still love Notre Dame. And, I had a lot of trouble with some of the Catholic Church problems, the women. But at the same time, I can't get rid of what it means. And I think that's always been there. And what I realize now is I'm lucky that I stumbled into a job that makes you face that every single day. Because if you didn't have any faith, you would get discouraged right away. Because we haven't changed. Homelessness is worse now than when I started 40 years ago. So I can't argue that we've really helped homelessness. I can say that we've been present in a lot of people's lives, offering them what I hope is the best of medical care, even when they were standing in light or doctors just had to be there. And that's been a joy. I worry that if I hadn't been a little serendipity, I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you one other thing that I was resonating for me, and since Steve's here, I can say that early on when we had this tuberculosis epidemic at Pine Street, it was multi-drug resistant, it was very complicated. But Paul Farmer was a student then. I don't know if, Steve, you know that. He came down as a student. I was his senior at that time, although no one was ever his senior. And he wanted to learn about this tuberculosis. And then we would occasionally be on panels later on, because we were both at the medical school. And he would stand up in front of these august panels and introduce me as this poor doctor who has never gotten more than a mile from medical school.
And explain who Paul Farmer is.
Oh, I'm sorry. For those of you who don't know, Paul Farmer was really a stunning human being who, as a medical student, started doing work in Haiti and then developed a thing called Partners in Health. And he really changed the world in many facets. He died at the age of 62 a couple of years ago, very suddenly and unfortunately. But Tracy Kidder wrote a book called Mountains Beyond Mountains about him, which you have to read. It's really one of the more important ones. But Paul really was international global health personified. But he would, at the end, he would introduce me that way, and I'd feel like about this big. But then he'd talk about what he'd done in Russia and Haiti and Rwanda and Peru. But then he would come back and he'd say, and I say this as my own lesson, he'd say, but don't forget that he's finding a mile from medical school all the disparities we're finding in all these other countries. And so he was trying to turn it into, in this kind of brilliant way of, I think we all have roles. This, right in front of us, even though we may not see it, are tons and tons of things that we can do to help others, no matter what your profession is, medicine, teaching, a policeman, and those opportunities to take care of people who are close to us, despite the global issues, was, I think, a matter of the faith. It was sort of liberation theology personified. And I think that's what we all do.
John, what role has faith played in your life, in your career?
Yeah, I think faith helps you navigate the nonlinearity. We all took some chances once upon a time, and working in athletics, it gets quite nonlinear on a daily basis too. So I think when you're rooted in faith, it helps you know that despite maybe some uncertainty, you're still on the right path. And I think the second thing that faith provides is a value system to anchor on whatever it is that you believe in. It allows you to be the same person day in, day out, whether you're facing pressure or stress or whatever the case may be. I think from those two vantage points, faith continues to be that stability for me, whether that's the 10,000-foot view of where life is taking me or the day-to-day, how do I want to show up for this meeting, for this person, for this conversation. It's a way to ground yourself in that.
Yeah. David, when you were talking about your experience in Ecuador, I was thinking about the times I've seen what I think is the face of God in another person, Cardinal Adam Maida, who is the cardinal in Detroit. And I was going over to Rome with him when he was elevated. And I looked at him, and we're on the plane, and I felt like I could see God in his face. And God was joy, God was kind, God was compassion. That's what I saw in his face. Is that part of what you saw in Ecuador that has animated your career?
In part, it's difficult to talk about this without sounding self-righteous. And so I come at this with significant humility. But when in medicine, and particularly working in a place like rural Ecuador where people don't have access to healthcare services, and because of their impoverishment, it's just diseases linger and they don't come in until they're at wit's end. And so you see a lot of death and you see a lot of just unbelievable suffering. And people in those situations, they go to God, they pray, and they do things that you don't normally see them do in the rest of their lives. And for me, that message that I got from that is that God is, your faith is a significant part of your life. You often don't go to it until you absolutely need it. And so the question is, how do you figure out a way to go to it even when you're not at wit's end, when you're not at the end of your rope? So that's the lesson that I've learned from Ecuadorians over the years.
Now I want to ask each of you to opine on what you do. Jim, you deal with homelessness. As you say, the problem today is greater than it was 40 years ago. What are we doing wrong? What do we still not understand about this problem?
As I look back, and I've evolved so much in all this, so here this is just evolution, and it may change again, but what I know is that when you see who's homeless, who do you take care of when you're out there, and the people who've been chronically homeless, you realize they've suffered unbelievable deprivation in their lives, trauma, sexual and physical abuse, being in poor schools, being in foster care, things where they just got devastated as children, and then 20 years or 40 years later, they're on the streets. And you realize that these are people that we failed a long time ago. I've never met anyone, or maybe one person I've met, who really wanted to be homeless. It just doesn't happen. And then I realized that if we're really going to be serious as a society about homelessness, that it's certainly about housing. We need to build housing. You got to do that for sure. But if you really hold a prism, think of the best metaphors, you hold a prism up to society and as homelessness, what gets refracted are the weaknesses in all of our systems. So where our correction system has not worked, our school systems have not worked, our labor and education systems haven't worked, those failures are the ones that are feeding homelessness down the line. So if we're going to really address it, we've got to address those weaknesses across the board. And I always said, I mentioned this before, that if somebody gave me all the money I needed and could do only one thing to stop homelessness, I'd fix our inner city schools, make sure the teachers are paid well and that we take care of kids. But that's one thing. That's a way of looking at homelessness as a broad, terrible scourge on our society. But then there's the other problem of there's 1 million people right now in America who are homeless, and they're not going to get housed for quite a while. And how do we take care of them? Do we ignore them, or do we really take care of them? And they're living lives, very public, very private lives in completely public places, and they get angry. Lots of stuff has been taken away from them. So I think our job as a society is to figure out how do we take care of them while we're working at the broader problem, and not to see one or the other, to see both ends.
So as I walk down the streets of New York and I see homeless people in my neighborhood, how do I help? What can I do? Do I say hello? Do I give them money? buy a card at Starbucks? I want to do something, but I don't know what to do.
This question haunts us all the time, and I'm looking at my friends who've been through this too. But Barbara McGinnis, who beat me up badly, I remember coming in, I'd go to Pine Street and everybody would ask me for money, ask me for something, and I said, Barbara, how do you deal with this? And she, in her best Catholic worker voice, would say, look, what people are looking for is just to be acknowledged. You don't have to give them money, just acknowledge them. Don't turn away. And I think, we have many homeless people on our board of directors, and they will tell you the worst thing of being homeless is the invisibility they feel, that people just ignore them. Our advice, and we tell this to our staff all the time, is just, you can't give money to everybody all the time, or even some of the time, but always acknowledge them and say hello, and let them know you realize who they are. And if you really want to know what we've learned, this may sound stupid, you guys, but now it's inflation may make it not so much a $5 Dunkin' Donuts card, but in Boston, a Dunkin' Donuts card, or a Starbucks, but Dunkin' Donuts is our kind of working class coffee. But that gives them a ticket to go in and get a cup of coffee and sit down inside and use a bathroom.
Yeah.
And it's like gold to them. And it's not drugs or alcohol or something like that. So that's what we've tended to do. We always carry a bunch of Dunkin' Donuts cards to give to people.
David, what about healthcare? What have you learned about solving the problem of healthcare?
Before we talk about solving it, I think that we need to understand it better. I think that it's a pretty American thing to take a very complex problem and practice reductionism and think if we could just do this and this, we'd fix everything. And we do that frequently, and as Winston Churchill said of the Americans during World War II, we do everything first and then we do the right thing. So I feel like oftentimes we jump to too many conclusions before we fully analyze something. And so analyzing it, understanding it, and the complexity of it, I think will allow us to understand that the answer is going to be complex and not simple. And the answer, I don't propose to have any answers to the American health system. I don't work in it. I look at it from afar. And I understand the Ecuadorian system because it's a smaller country. You can get your head around it. But the U.S. healthcare system, it's difficult to get your head around it. So you can think about ideas like single payer, things like why are we spending so much money in the last 6 months of people's lives? But again, that tends to go towards that reductionist approach of just do this or just do that and we'll get it fixed. I don't have a good answer, but I just propose that we learn to understand it better.
We need to do a better job of understanding it. Yeah. And John, when it comes to confidence, self-confidence, how do we, when we have those dark nights of the soul, how do we build that confidence back? How do we hold on to that?
That's a probably 8-9 figure question, but I think.
Come on, don't you have a bumper sticker
Right,
that I
yeah.
can think about?
I'll give some bumper sticker material in the sense that I should give credit fully to our sports psychology team with this, but one of their ethos is that we are never going to separate the person from the performer. And our kids at Notre Dame especially, they have accountability to be excellent in the community, to be excellent academically, athletically, spiritually, as a family member, a brother, sister, daughter, son, all of these things. And those affect their self-confidence. Those affect their self-efficacy. Those affect their performance. They affect their ability to sleep or to have those more technical or sustainable ways to have a healthier lifestyle. And really for us, it's just appreciating those. I think we're careful, like David articulated very well, to have an overly reductionist approach to any of those things. But in sport or in self-confidence or in any of these aspects of it, we are still, in a sense, playing a probability game. Sports chaotic. It's what drives a lot of this industry, and the unpredictability of it is beautiful in a sense, but it creates a lot of stress at the individual level, that uncertainty, that unpredictability. And so just knowing the landscape that you're on is really helpful for us, and knowing that the person underneath those shoulder pads of that helmet has just other aspects of their being that are equally, if not more important. And I think to close with that, we really try to also help them build an identity that's not just their athlete self. With all of those pieces coming together, that's ultimately how we can best not separate the person from the performer is help them develop the person. And that's the for forever promise. That's the most important thing for us. Yes, we love winning championships and we're going to continue to do that, but it's also making sure that we take care of some of those other things the best we can.
Yeah, and I think the great example is Tyler Buckner's letter that he wrote. Tyler, who played quarterback at Notre Dame, went to Alabama, came back, played lacrosse, was on the national championship lacrosse team that we mentioned a few times. Now he's going to walk back on to the football team. And he has written, find the letter, it is absolutely beautiful because he is a gifted writer and he expresses himself very well, and the journey he has taken is really amazing. So before we close, I realize I've talked way too much. Does anybody have any questions? What Mark said is he wants to know what they have learned from the people in Boston, the people in Ecuador, our student athletes, about how we can improve our healthcare.
I guess I could say a couple things about that. Not all that necessarily insightful, but I can tell you that Ecuadorians see life as a cycle, and although they agonize over death, they accept the fate that we all end up at. And so there is not this overwhelming expenditure on healthcare services near end of life because people simply accept it. It's also a culture that relinquishes control, maybe not by choice, but just because of their lot in life. And issues of control can be things that we love in our culture, but they can be costly, and that can convert into expensive bills in medicine. They don't do that there. I think those are just two things that I've learned along the way, but you guys.
Yeah, I think it's a probing question from the American healthcare system, but a couple of thoughts. In Massachusetts, we had Romney Care, so everybody got insurance, essentially. All homeless people got insurance back during the days of Romney. And it was radical for us. So all of a sudden, everybody who was homeless had insurance. And what was striking to me, because I'm a maniac for single payer and we need to be sure, what was striking to me is that didn't help because we had a system that still didn't understand them or take care of them. And so then we started thinking what's for the very vulnerable in our society. I think we need Father Hesburgh. We need somebody who's going to understand them, know them, and stick with them. So we now believe that it's continuity of care that really results in quality of care. And you need to be their Beatrice, carrying them through this healthcare system from the street corner right through to the ICU and back. And that tends to be the best thing we can do. But we've got a very expensive system. It's very hard to get around the expenses. But that would be what Paul Farmer would have called accompaniment. But that, I think, is what's missing in our healthcare system. It's so fragmented. We got told by homeless people, for example, we had to be on call for them 24 hours a day. So we answer their call. So when they call us, they get somebody they know. When I call my own doctor, I get someone I've never heard of before. And I realize it makes a huge difference because you know each other. But anyway, that's what would be my cheap recommendation to a crazy system.
Mark, much like on this panel, I'm also a fake doctor in my own home too. My wife is a physician, and what she and I talk a lot about is actually, this is a little bit more technical or down to the individual level, but the importance of sleep. Pretty much every catastrophic disease, mental health issue, whatever the case may be, a lot of things affecting our society and our healthcare system. Sleep is not something that we understand as well as we think that we do. I think in part because we all do it every day. And so it's one of those things in medicine that's assumed that we actually have a better understanding than we actually do. And reimagining the way that we provide support to people, either with known or unknown sleep disturbances or issues, I think is a really powerful way to see some of our outcomes improve.
Yes.
Michael Brennan, class of '84, and I want to thank you all for an inspiring presentation on our common humanity and raising up love and solidarity and grace. So I want to say thank you first. My question has to do with sustainability. That people talk a lot about burnout and self-care, okay? And I'm really taken with this concept of more of a systemic moral injury happening to frontline workers, and I'm going to address it. What sustains you in the work that goes beyond Pilates and yoga and water, and then also guarding against savior syndrome. You both are in, you're both in these high-profile positions. What do you do to guard?
I'll answer the first one because Jim's the savior, not me. For me, is to not run it alone. And so the way to get around burnout is to make sure that you have lots of great support people around you, people that share all those difficulties, challenges, joys, privileges, and do that with as many people as possible. And feeling part of something that's bigger than oneself is a way for me that I've figured out how to get around the issue of burnout. But having said that, I've evolved. I just moved back to the United States last year after 25 years in Ecuador. Don't suffer from founder syndrome. More than happy to have created a team in Ecuador that gets called at 3 o'clock in the morning when the hospital runs out of syringes instead of me. Right, so that's a great thing. So that trend, and by the way, they do it better than I have ever done it. For me, that's a way to address the issue of burnout. And the savior issue, it's learning how to practice humility every day. And by the way, that dependence on other people and working with other people, I think probably helps one get over this whole savior complex a little bit. Jim?
Yeah, thank you for that question, by the way. And Dr. Brennan does street medicine, by the way, for the last few years. So you need to talk to him and find out. Your class, by the way, is amazing. Your 1984 class. But you know what I think about? I have my offhanded answer to that is I have this really amazing wife and stunning 10-year-old child right here. And I
Gabriella.
promise you, I am no savior when I walk through the door. No, I don't get So they keep me grounded, right? Gabriella and Jill. But then the other thing, I don't know if this helps with a bit of the sustainability, but one of the other things I learned from Barbara McGinnis and the homeless people that put us together was they hated somebody like me. I was going to come and be the savior for a year, right? And that's not what they wanted. They wanted someone who was going to come and stick with them. And so I spent a whole year worried about the fact that they didn't really trust me to stay. And it's only when you make that commitment, I'm sure David's been through this, that they know you're going to be there, that you begin to set up some sort of sustainable program. And to hedge against that, the homeless people made us work in teams. So I've never been able to have my own panel of patients. I've always shared that with a nurse practitioner or physician assistant and a psychiatrist and now a recovery coach, so that if I go away, every homeless person still has the group they know. And that really lets you know that you can't do it yourself. And also is the best guard we have against the ups and the real downs that we go through. You share that as a team. So that's what I would say. That there's also the financial sustainability that I think is an issue to talk about sometime, maybe over scotch. But that's a reality. How do you maintain a mission without a margin?
We have run out of time, and I apologize. But before we go, I want to urge you to read 2 books, because these 2 books are why this panel came together. The first is Rough Sleepers by Tracy Kidder, who wrote a book about Jim's work in Boston. And I read that book, and it changed my perspective on homelessness. And I have recommended it so much that I think I should get a percentage of the royalties at this point. But it's extraordinary. And then right after I read that book, I read Long Road from Quito by Tony Hill, who wrote about Andean health in Ecuador. And again, I found my perspective on healthcare completely changed. And John is writing the next chapter of athletic and academic excellence at Notre Dame, and we are so very grateful. How about a round of applause for our
I wanted to take the prerogative as the oldest person here to thank Anne, who's truly remarkable for putting this all together. Thank you.